What's up? My name is Josiah Haken, and I've been working with homeless folks for over a decade. I'm convinced that one of the biggest reasons we have not been able to solve the homelessness crisis in our country is because we fundamentally do not understand why it happens or what or can be done about it. In this podcast, I'm going to interview friends of mine who have experienced homelessness firsthand, experts who have spent years of their lives trying to provide services and resources to their unhoused neighbors, and advocates and theologians who will help us think differently about the issue altogether. You are not going to agree with everyone I interview on this podcast. You may not even agree with me, and that is okay. Let's throw out our assumptions and consider the possibility that maybe there is more to this story than we previously thought. Welcome to the Neighbors with No Doors podcast. Alrighty, I am here with my friend and someone who I admire in the space of homelessness. I can just give a little background on how I met and heard of Josh Dean. Josh is the executive director of Human.nyc. He's a fierce advocate for our homeless neighbors in New York City. And I basically saw his name pop up on a bunch of news articles, and I talked to people who knew him and knew what the work he was doing, and I just was instantly a fan, and I wanted to connect as much as possible. And so Josh and I grabbed coffee a couple years ago, and sort of ever since then we're fast friends, and it's just such a pleasure, honestly, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me a little bit and tell us a little bit about the work that you do, and kind of how our friends in the street can hopefully experience a little love and a little joy because of the work that you're doing and the work that we're doing. So thank you, Josh Dean, for joining me, man.
Yeah, of course. So happy to be here. And the love is very much reciprocal. Admire what you all do at City Relief so much. And so many people that we know out on the streets have benefited from the work that you do and speak so highly of it. So, yeah, of course. So happy to be here.
So Josh, tell me, like, this is not like I tell people all the time, like I didn't grow up like dreaming about being an outreach worker, and like I didn't like when I was a kid, I wasn't like, what I'm going to do when I grow up, I'm going to work to help homeless folks. Like that was not on the radar. I don't think that there's probably a lot of people out there that dreamed of being maybe a homeless advocate. So for you, like how did it begin? Like where did you grow up? And what was your first introduction to the reality of homelessness?
Yeah. So similar story in many ways. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, just outside Princeton. I don't think I ever met anyone who was homeless when I lived there. And then I moved to New York City when I was 18 years old to go to NYU. So, that was a huge shock to the system in many ways. One of them being that on my way to and from class, I was often, encountering people who were homeless. Um, I did my best to just, introduce myself and talk to them. There were a few people, especially as I grew older and got to know the city better. There were a few people that lived near where I lived, and um, when I started cooking, sometimes I would bring food outside for them, and hopefully it wasn't terrible. And then um, I just when I could did little things that I could to people that I was seeing, especially those who I would see regularly. Um, and then I got involved with this organization, which was actually started by a friend of mine in college. He had this
Okay.
idea um, for an app, as all 20 somethings do when they're in college. And the app basically, when you saw someone who was homeless on the streets, you could ask if they needed anything. And if they were like, yeah, I'm hungry, you could drop a pin at their location, and all of the nearby users would be alerted, like, hey, this person on 14th and 3rd, is hungry. And then if somebody's walking by who has the app and they have extra food, they can go and bring it to the person. There were a couple really, really nice moments where like one person requested a Snapple, and then somebody like 20 minutes later showed up with a peach Snapple, and he's like, whoa, like what is this? But for the most part, people were asking for the same things over and over again. So much as the app was a cool idea, I was the person who came in and said, hey, we don't really need this. The same things keep popping up over and over again. And we switched from the app to we got a storage unit in Greenwich Village. We rounded up some NYU volunteers, and a couple nights a week we went out with backpacks full of socks, tampons and pads, T-shirts, mylar blankets and just started to give those out and talk to people. And slowly but surely, those conversations kind of transitioned from you know what do you need in the short term to what do you need in the long term. And that's when we started to hear about people's experiences in the shelter system. That's why when we began starting to hear about people's experience trying to find housing, and we were hearing the same stories over and over again, people hitting the same walls, the same barriers. And um, slowly but surely, this original idea for an app to deliver things to people turned into a grassroots advocacy organization. But it's really always been a matter of just listening to people and hearing what they have to say, and trying to work at their direction the best we can.
It's fascinating to me because it is there are so many different um, like there's so many different people, who are walking around, going to class, passing people in the street. I just think it's incredible that you were able to sort of transition that, you know coming from the suburban context into the city for school, but then immediately translating that into action. Like, you just started engaging with people. I mean, just accurate. Like, have you ever thought, like, what is it about, like, how you were raised, or what motivates you, like, how, like, just being I know it seems so painfully obvious, but there are so many people who are really good people, really well-intentioned people, but they never are able to sort of make that shift from sort of that, oh, I'm a kind person who feels bad for that person I see on the sidewalk, to actually packing supplies, mobilizing, fellow students, getting a storage unit. Like, just out of curiosity, like, have you ever thought about, like, what is it that kind of motivated you to kind of move into that space of action?
Yeah, I think it's a couple things. And when I think back to the students that came to volunteer, it was kind of a combination of these two extremes. On the one hand, it was people who grew up really privileged and had never seen something like this before, and then they get to New York and they're like, "Whoa! Like, what is this? Like, how are we as a society letting this happen?" And kind of this just shock. And then it's people that grew up. Maybe their parents at one point were struggling to make ends meet, or were on the verge of homelessness or experienced homelessness themselves, and coming from this place of deep empathy for the community that we were trying to go out there and meet and connect with. So I think for my case personally, it was kind of a shock at first. And then I think also, I mean, the way I was just brought up with my parents, they were both really, really kind and generous people, and really took care of people in my family. Um, so it was, I think, ingrained in me to be looking out for those who might need something extra. And um, yeah, I don't think I worded that in the best way, but yeah, I think that was kind of it. There was no
No, that's
like
great.
crazy moment in particular. I mean, there were quite a few people around my apartment who I got to know, and possibly the fact that they were so friendly and warm, helped me to extend, push my comfort zone a bit. I imagine those initial few people helped with that. But yeah, that's what I would say.
No, that makes perfect sense. And and so Human.nyc was sort of born, right? I mean, so tell me a little bit about, like, I mean, I remember my first introduction to Human.nyc. How did it sort of break through into this sort of, like, you guys are now, any Times article, any New York space that considers, that tries to talk about homelessness, like, you guys are really one of the top advocacy entities in New York City. um, and that doesn't just magically happen. Like, how did you kind of build some momentum to actually start to give voice to the needs of our homeless neighbors in New York City?
Yeah, I think looking back, the thing that I'm really grateful we did was we didn't rush anything. We didn't come into this space saying, "Oh, we know what needs to happen." We took a really long time, multiple years of just going out and doing outreach and listening, and we we started in 2016. I don't think we appeared in an article, met with a council member, did anything until late 2018, early 2019. I'd need to look back, but um, we really, really did our homework. We got to know people. We were literally going out with like a map that showed not like a geographic map, but like a step by step map of like what it takes to get from the streets into housing. And we would go up to people who were homeless and you'd be like, "Hey, does this look right?" And they'd be like, this part's right, but actually my experience was this and that. We go, okay. And of course, not, no one has the same experience as someone else, but there are systemic trends, and you know, we learned them from the street. Um, the other really valuable thing we did when we were ready to kind of, start getting into the advocacy space was we hired my colleague Lyndon, who I could speak so highly of. She's amazing. And she was previously herself a homeless outreach worker here in the city. So she had this, years and years of experience in homeless services, and kind of was taking the approach of, I've been in this world before, so I know what goes wrong from the outreach worker's perspective. Um, so having her, join the team, um, one of the first thing we did was this project, the journey map, which was the final result of this effort to map out the process from living on the streets to getting housing, and it ended up being a dynamic website with video interviews, a 73-page report when you put it all into a PDF. We really, really, really mapped out this thing, and I think part of the reason that we've been able to, you know, speak out is because we did our homework so thoroughly. And another thing that's really valuable is oftentimes when journalists reach out to us and they want to hear something. I mean, I might give them a little information on background, but more often than not, I should say, "Hey, you should speak to this person who went through this." Um, and so often there are these articles that come out that we worked really hard on in like the background, and it ends up being like, we're not really in it, but that's fine. It's most important that we get people from to be able to speak firsthand from their experience. And I think in particular populations on the street have not had that opportunity before. So what little we can do to bridge that gap, I think, is really important.
And I think I totally agree with you. I mean, because I also think it's interesting how, when people do go out and reporters do go out and try to do stories on homelessness and they try to interview people, what they do is they don't have relationship with folks who are actually experiencing homelessness. So they just grab whatever one-off person they can find, or someone they can get on, talk on camera or give a quote, and then it ends up almost sort of painting or reinforcing stereotypes that people have about homeless folks, um, in some cases in a negative way, because they just pick someone random instead of actually going to someone who's got not only the lived experience but also the ability to communicate that lived experience. And that's something that I think you guys have done so well. Because I remember that project you did, because when I've been training outreach leaders for City Relief, I've done, I sort of drew up my own sort of map that I kind of came up with, but it's not a 72-page researched and like peer reviewed document, right? Like it's like me with a napkin and a Sharpie. Like, this is how you go. This is where you go. This go Bellevue, Affik, Path. Like this is how the outreach works. This is 9 months. All these things that I'm just like scrawling together. So when you guys came up with that project, I remember just being blown away. I was like, man, I got to meet these folks, because it's incredible what you guys have been able to do. Just
Yeah,
love it.
thank you. No, that was I think back to how much work went into that project. We had a videographer out doing videos. She did a really great job. Bree. We had Lyndon working on the policy. We had two students from NYU who volunteered to stay for the summer, and they were helping write up some of the proposals. We were calling different cities from across the country and learning about how they did things. So yeah, well, the team really put a lot of work into that, and a lot of people who were experiencing homelessness themselves really put a lot of time into that too.
Yeah, it was an incredible project that you guys put together. So let's talk a little bit generally about homelessness, and then also, but like specifically even in New York City, right? Like you mentioned, you contacted other cities. Obviously, homelessness is not unique to New York City; it's a nationwide and a global problem. Um, but tell us a little bit about the homelessness in New York City, and like I know, New York City. I mean, I know a little bit about this, but I want our listeners to hear it from someone besides me. Like New York City is a unique city when it comes to like how it responds to homelessness, in that
Yeah.
it's a right to shelter city. Can you explain to anyone who's listening who may not understand what a right to shelter city is, and how that impacts what they see and what they experience when they see someone in the street, and maybe even why someone may not choose to sleep and take advantage of their right to shelter in our context?
Yeah. So New York City is a right to shelter city, which means that, um, in theory, anyone who wants to stay in a shelter has the right to do so. There are a lot of reasons why one might not do that. Um, when it's a family or even an adult couple, the right doesn't extend in the same way. In theory, like every person, in an adult couple, which we come across a lot, um, if it's a person who identifies as a man, a person who identifies as a woman, they'll be separated into a men's shelter and a women's shelter. So unless they meet these specific criteria that are very, very difficult to meet. But what we see when people see someone who's homeless and living on the streets or sleeping on the subways, that person has decided, um, understandably so, that they feel safer living on the streets or living on the subways than they would in the shelter. I say understandably so because I've heard stories over and over again about why people make that decision. And truthfully, if I became homeless tomorrow, I think I would do the same. Um, they describe, walking into a facility, um, having to share a room with potentially dozens of people that they don't know, which, especially during a pandemic, is really scary and dangerous. People report having their stuff stolen all the time, not just by other people in the shelter, but by, people who work there as well. Um, and then it's just, I can't think if I was homeless, and potentially working through some sort of mental health or substance use or whatever it may be. I can't imagine a worse place to be than sleeping in a room with a dozen other people who are going through that exact same thing. I've met people on the streets who say, I'm on the streets because I'm trying to stay sober, and because they were put in a shelter, surrounded by people going through the same things that they are. That's not in any way a healthy environment. It sounds extremely stressful, traumatic. Um, so, truthfully, people are walking by people who are homeless every single day, and they don't know it. These are kids that live in shelters, single parents that live in shelters, families that live in shelters, and you wouldn't know it that they're homeless by walking by them. In fact, I walk by people who I know to be homeless on the streets and subways, but when they're not sitting, with a cup or with a cardboard sign, they're blending in with everyone else. So the the general perception of homelessness is actually, um, street homelessness, subway homelessness is predominantly what people think of when they think of homelessness. When in reality, in New York City, that's, you know 10% of the whole homeless population, maybe less than that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember meeting a guy in the Bronx who had just been released from Rikers. He did 10 years, and he was dressed like, he looked silly. I mean, really, he just looked silly. He was like this 6'4" dude, wearing like snakeskin shoes and like a woman's cardigan, and I, again, not that if that's his vibe and that's what he wanted to rock with, then that's great. I have no judgment, but he clearly was uncomfortable, right? Like he just wasn't that what he was visibly uncomfortable. And he told me that he had been released from Rikers, went right to Bellevue, got placed in a shelter. That yeah, it's a right to shelter. He got placed into a shelter because he had nowhere else to stay, and he took all he had used all his commissary money to buy a pair of Timberlands, a hoodie, and a pair of jeans. Like from 10 years in jail, he had all his money that he had saved up, like whatever it is, like some freakishly
Yeah.
small amount every day, and he used all of it to buy Timberlands, jeans, and a hoodie. But he took them off and put them in a neat little pile because that's what you're trained to do. When you're in prison, he still had all the routines of how to like handle his business. And but while he slept, someone stole his stuff, and
Oh
he
man.
said he woke up and went to the security guard to report the theft, and the security guard was wearing his shoes, that he went to report the theft to. And again, I mean, I'm not laughing because it's funny. It's devastating, but it's just like this
Yeah.
reality of, I just think a lot of people miss out on just the stress and the strain and the risk that they're taking by going into a public space where there seems to be, and New York Times has done a bunch of stories lately on the corruption in the shelter system, the nonprofits that are running sort of scams on the side, like staffing security and lining their own pockets with it. I mean, this is all public information now, right? Um, and yet it's the people themselves who are in need or desperate for a place to sleep that end up being victimized by this system. So like, you've heard me say this 100 times. Like I'm convinced people don't choose to sleep in the street. They choose not to sleep in shelters, which is,
Yeah. And
obviously
I stole that line from you because it really is true. It's not a it's not no one's there by choice.
yeah.
No one wants to be very clear. Somebody who chooses to avoid the shelter system to sleep on the streets or subways, that does not mean that they don't want permanent housing. That does not mean they want their own place. That they don't want their own place. That just means that they couldn't bear to live in the shelter system, which is a totally different thing. And so often people conflate the two. Like this person, people want to live on the street. People want to live on the subways. No, nobody wants to.
So, I mean, and tell me about like, because then what we do is we coin this term, right, in our politics and in our sort of national conversation around homelessness. We describe them as like service resistant, right? Like we end up placing the blame of this horrible situation onto the people, onto the victims themselves. Can you tell me a little bit, talk about the term service resistant and how that sort of conflates what our homeless neighbors are experiencing?
I hate that term so
Yeah.
much. Basically, what it does is it shifts the blame from the systemic failures towards individuals, and it's a saying. I remember interviewing someone, and one of the questions we used to ask was, the mayor says people are service resistant. What would you say in response to the mayor? And they all looked like shocked. They were like, service resistant? Like, no. I like if the service you're offering is go to a shelter, then yes, I'm don't want to do that. But I'm not service resistant. Like I want to get off the streets. I want housing. Like I want to work. Um and people were just so offended by that term, and understandably so, because they can feel the intention of it, which is to blame them. Um, and it's something that elected officials, bureaucrats have used to take the blame off of themselves. We we took some elected officials out and just we asked people like, "Would you want housing?" And they were like, "Of course." So it's really really frustrating, and it's kind of a cruel and evil thing that happens, but we see a lot of it, unfortunately. Um, and I think we and other advocates and homeless people have called out the usage of that term so much, but there's other ways to package that same idea, and that idea is very much ingrained in a lot of people who are making these decisions. And it's just devastating because uh, it really does uh, perpetuate just a false narrative. Not even it's harmful, but it's not true.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and, for one of the things I've really appreciated about your work, and again, just even our friendship, but just the idea of like running against the current of that narrative, right? Like the narrative itself is is part of the problem. And now, because I know I was interviewed recently by somebody, and like, well, what's the solution to homelessness? I'm like, well, duh, it's housing, right? Like anyone who knows, has worked with homeless folks for any amount of time, the answer to that question is like the most obvious question ever. And I also think that there's this other piece of it, which is, yes, we absolutely need housing, but in order to get to the housing, there needs to be a large scale shift in the narrative around the people that need the housing, right? Otherwise, people will never, there'll be never any enough motivation to like move the chains and actually get some progress. And I know you've put a lot of work into this, into the human plan, in terms of New York's, response. And tell us about the human plan. I mean, I'm obviously, I'm biased. I know, I'm not even confessing that I'm an objective, I'm a huge fan. And yeah, tell us about the human plan. Tell us what the kind of the pieces are, and how we can, keep pushing the ball forward with that.
Yeah, the human plan was a project that we started leading up to the mayoral and city council elections that took place in November of 2021, and we were reaching this point where we were kind of like, okay, is the current mayor gonna do anything else, or are we, wasting our time here? And the other advocates really pushed through some great things at the end of the term, but we decided that our efforts as a small team were best spent preparing for the incoming administration. So we sat down with a group of 11 people who are or were street homeless or subway homeless. And we interviewed each of them and we said, what are the main things you want to see the next administration changed? We took down everyone's ideas. We had group conversations, like sounding room type things. We included outreach workers, and a secret person from DHS who was very helpful, the Department of Homeless Services. And we basically looked at all the ideas and broke them up into 4 different categories, 4 pillars. The 4 pillars are, the first 2 are really around kind of the front facing end of it, like how do you build trust with people? So the first one is about reimagining street homeless outreach. And this is one that you and I have spoken about, but I'll recap our conversation for everyone listening. Basically, the Department of Homeless Services, in line with the service resistant nonsense, has this ridiculous notion that if you give people on the streets basic needs items, that will disincentivize them from going into the shelters because they'll get so comfortable out on the streets. So they don't want us giving out socks like we do on the streets because they think that somebody's sitting there like,
That
oh,
pair
I
of
got socks.
socks is the reason. That pair of socks is the reason someone is out there. He's like, I could go into this apartment, but you know what? I will miss out on that pair of socks.
Exactly. It's just so like just shows how out of touch the people who are making those decisions are. And um, I had this experience recently, and then I'll get back to the pillars, where I was with I brought a journalist out to meet some people who were being constantly swept, and what that means is Department of Sanitation, NYPD, DHS were coming and throwing away all of their stuff. Again, that's part of the plan to like make life so uncomfortable that people will cave in and go to a shelter. Um, and I brought this journalist out, and I was like, "There's this guy I want you to meet. I met him, a little while ago." Um, and he starts to talk, this guy, and he's like, "I trust Human. I trust this team. They actually want to help, and these other groups don't. These other outreach teams don't." And at the end of that, I pulled the journalist aside. I was like, "Do you want to know how many times I met that guy?" And he said, "How many?" I said, "Twice. This was the second time." And the reason that he felt he could trust us was because we brought things. We showed we didn't offer to connect him to, we didn't have any conversation about housing, shelter, anything. We just showed in this one moment, like, hey, we can bring this thing. And it's so unfortunate, he was saying those things. And on the one hand, it's like, it's good to hear that he felt that way about us, but devastating to hear that he viewed the outreach teams as, an entity that couldn't help him. He didn't see what they were trying to do to help him because in that first interaction, they didn't they weren't able to provide any sort of tangible support. Easy wins, as you put it. Um, so what's also frustrating is I know outreach workers, they want to bring stuff out. They're told they
Absolutely.
can't. And it's so frustrating for them too. So, um, that's kind of the first part is like, let's stop this nonsense of treating people, trying to make their lives so miserable. Let's treat them like humans, which is why it's called Human Plan, and just meet them where they're at and show we can help in small ways as we work for the big ways. And then, of course, the bigger ways, which is the third and fourth pillar, is and I won't get into it too much, is about housing. Like you said, that is the solution. But if we had all the housing that we needed today, we would still have this period where we need to undo so much of the damage that's been done to people's trust by treating them awfully, by
Yeah.
throwing them out of the subways, by throwing away their personal belongings, by refusing to give them the most basic of human needs, by not, people are walking around the city trying to find somewhere to use the bathroom, to have a glass of water. Like, we're really depriving people of the most basic human needs in an attempt to try to coax them into a shelter that they aren't going to go to.
It reminds me, I had a conversation with a guy on last Thursday, I think. And we were trying to help. This is in a different city, actually. This is in Paterson, New Jersey, where we operate as well. And they have a point in time count that they're doing. I know it's the point in time count, something that is a nationwide thing, where the government tries to get an idea of how many people are experiencing homelessness in every specific area. And the way they do that is they send out volunteers with surveys, and they try to count people who are in the street or in the subways or in the shelters. And I just happened to be out at our outreach, and we had these surveys, and I got to tell you, like, asking people to give me their personal information and having, like, trying to get information from people without having any incentive, without having anything to give them in return for their information is madness. It's completely useless. I got zero survey. The only survey I got done was because the outreach director, who works with me, is like, hey, I know this guy. Hey, Freddie, come here and answer some questions. Like, the only reason, like, there was
Yeah.
nothing I could have done, like, to get
So
that survey filled out without some kind of incentive or some kind of easy win that, like, we've talked about.
yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. One of our employees, and we hired three of our members a couple months ago, and they've been doing outreach work and doing such amazing work, and also presenting new ideas. And one of the new ideas was from my colleague Charmel, and she suggested, like, hey, when you're talking to this outreach worker, like, you're giving them all of your information, your name, your social security number, where you slept last night, all of this, and then they don't give you anything back.
Give you squat.
Um, and she's like, there should be a receipt. Like, they should give you something that's like, this is what we talked about today. This is my name and contact information, and this is what I'm going to be working on next. Simple idea, but
It's a great
I
idea.
think, yeah, I think
It's a
it's a
great
like a
idea.
really, yeah. So good idea, Charmel. We're gonna keep working on it.
Heck yeah, yeah. But again, here's the crazy thing, right? Like, any company, any company in America understands that this is just the way it works. Like, they fill out this survey and get the opportunity to be entered for some kind of drawing, or fill out the survey and we'll give you some stars at your Starbucks, the next coffee shop. Like, it's just, we understand that this is not like how we operate in the human world of, like, getting information from people. And yet for some reason it's like, oh, well, they're homeless, so, like, they'll just want to give us all their information with nothing in return, no incentive. And these are people who have been betrayed, abused, traumatized, moved from point of, like, survival. They're not sleeping well. So, like, they're already sort of, like, exhausted just in general. So giving you their, anyway, it just makes no sense to me. I remember I walked away from that going, like, how on earth are we supposed to actually get any valuable information from this kind of approach? And it just doesn't, and it goes back to your point about outreach. Like, if we're not building trust, and that's the other thing is, like, how, there's all these stats about, like, you have to have like 116 encounters or some ridiculous, I'm making that up, right? Like, it's a lot of encounters with one person in order to make a single step in progress. And to your point, like it took you 2 times to meet this person, and all of a sudden you have this established trust. And I've experienced the same thing. Like there are people who would like go to war on my behalf because I gave them a cup of soup, a pair of socks, and a listening ear. And they're not going to talk to anybody else except me when it comes down to their situation because of that trust that's been established by that just tangible generosity that I think so many communities and cities and governments are just totally missing. So anyway,
Yeah, and it's not to say that, again, it's like if somebody is doesn't want to talk to an outreach team, there's probably a really good reason for that. One of my other colleagues, I won't mention his name here just because I didn't ask, but he basically had this experience where he was when he was homeless, he was contacted by a group of he was engaged by a group of outreach workers and police officers, and the police ended up being awful to him. They took him into a holding cell because he was lying down on the subway. They gave him a ticket, and the outreach workers were part of that. And there was this old program that thankfully is done now, where the outreach workers would go pick him up from the holding cell and then offer to bring him to a shelter. So he had this experience and was like, "I'm never talking to this group again." Um, and that's like such an understandable experience because his first contact, he ended up in a holding cell when he was approached with, "Do you need help?" So like, why would he ever interact with them again? That's why I say, there's so much work we have to do to undo the damage that was done by. Well, first we need to reverse this approach, and then we need to work really hard to undo all the damage that was done. But it does not mean that people do not want to come off the streets. It does not mean that people do not want housing. It just means that we need to do this better, in a better, more humane way.
and that again to my housed friends who are listening, right, or watching, like I think about it this way: like if I had a friend, even because that happened directly to your colleague, right? Like that experience was a personal one. I'm thinking of even all the people around your colleague who have heard that experience and are now internalizing that risk and that reality through secondhand and third hand accounts, which then perpetuates this idea that the city
Right.
is not, and which then begs the question, like, I mean, I know for me, if I have a friend who gets food poisoning at a restaurant, right? Like if someone goes to a specific restaurant nearby, they end up getting food poisoning. You think I'm ever going to go back to that restaurant? Like, I'm going to be like, oh, my friend got food poisoning there. Sure, honey, let's go schedule a date and get a reservation. Of course not. Like, that's absurd. I'm going to be like, no way. I'm not touching that
You're
place.
being restaurant resistant, Josiah.
I'm restaurant resistant. Exactly. Exactly. But it just makes perfect sense, right? Like these folks have these terrible experiences. I remember I had a conversation with the former, commissioner of the Human Resources Administration. I think it's Stephen Banks. Um, and I remember him asking me like, what can you guys do? Like, what do you want to talk about? And I was like, well, candidly, you guys have a reputation problem. I was like, when the NYPD is approaching our outreach workers, going, "Hey, we're doing this like uh, expungement of this record expungement program where anyone who comes into the police station is going to be, for petty crimes, or we're going to just expunge their records." But we're telling them, and they think it's a trap. They think it's a lie. They think it's a joke. So they're actually asking us, like, "Can you tell your guests and about this opportunity?" And it's like, well, if you guys have to come to us to leverage our credibility to help people, then why not change the way you're doing things so that you can actually have the reputation of trust that can then actually make progress? Because it's just, you're right. I mean, the word is out, right? People in the street, they don't need convincing. They believe the shelters are a mess, and they're not going to go in no matter how much, depending on the situation. But
Right. And I think conversely, if you start offering people housing, then a lot of people are going to be like, "Wait a second, this is working.
yep,
Like, what's this group again? How do I get in touch with them?"
absolutely.
Um, so there's there's two sides to that, and I think the flip side is, let's use that word of mouth and the fact that this community is so interconnected with each other, and work that in a positive way. But we need the housing to do that first.
Absolutely. So, I mean, one question I'm trying to ask everybody who I talk to, because I think it's just super important, is like if you could convince everyone listening, like if you knew that everyone listening, now again, maybe it's like three people, I don't know how many people are going to listen to this, but if you could convince all three people who are listening to this, um, of one thing that we get wrong about homelessness, like on a macro level, and you knew that they would walk away convinced about what you're saying, what would you say? What would you say that if you knew that it would land with the people who are listening and it would change some minds and hearts?
We've asked this question to a lot of people experiencing homelessness, and their answer is pretty uniform, which is that this can happen to anyone.
Hmm.
They didn't expect to ever become homeless themselves. One thing after another happened, and here they are. And that is the message that they wanted to convey. So my first answer is to kind of repeat what people have shared with me. I'll approach this question a little differently, and just share a story. So I play soccer quite a lot, as you know. Um, and one of the wonderful ways that I play is I play on a team of single adults who are homeless themselves or used to be homeless. Before the pandemic, we would practice twice a week at a shelter on Ward's Island, and I got to know these guys really well. And we started to play in leagues together. So we were playing against like companies that their HR department put up the funding and got a group together, and they would go play. And they had some good players for sure. And our team was out there, and we were typically the only team with people of color or a significant number of people of color on the team because, again, this was a league that everyone else paid for. So we um, we faced our fair share of bias from the referees, and we were punished accordingly for that. And there was one game where we were up 3-2 with 2 minutes left, and the referee called a penalty against us, and it was an awful call, awful call. And our guys lost it. They were devastated. We had fought so hard to keep that lead, um, and they scored 3-3. And then a minute later, they go back into the box. This guy like trips over himself, and the ref calls another penalty. They scored again, and we lost 4-3. And I have never. I mean, these guys, our team, they were beside themselves. I mean, this meant so much to them. And the coach on our team, this guy Reed, is amazing. He, slowly we began to lower the temper a little bit and just like calm down, and it was awful, and we were all really upset. And I went over to this guy on our team named Lonnie, and I was like, unlucky, man, like we'll get him next time. That was my way of trying to console him. And his eyes open wide, and he looks at me and he goes, unlucky, we weren't unlucky, we were robbed. And I was like, I just hung my head in shame. I was like, yeah, we were robbed, we weren't, he's 100% right. But the way that I experienced that as a person from privilege was like, that was unlucky. Like, it happens. But for him, this was just another instance where life robbed him. And he was an amazing player. And a couple months ago, the pandemic, like so many other people, he had housing at one point and fell back into homelessness. Um, and he was asleep on the train, and somebody stabbed him and killed him. And we found out shortly after. And I think a way that I could have looked at this before that moment where he kind of put me in my place was like, damn, like Lonnie's so unlucky. Like he was on this train, but he wasn't unlucky. He was robbed, and in this case, he was robbed of his life. And there's a reason why it was him and not me or one of the volunteers on the team. Um, it was because he didn't have a home, and that makes life more dangerous. So I think if I could like try to land one point with people, it's just homelessness is like one injustice after another, after another, after another. And it's easy to view some things in isolation, like, this person can't find a place to use the bathroom, and that's homelessness, or this person like is waiting in a long line for soup, and that's homelessness. But like, it's just one thing after another, after another, after another, after another. And this is obviously a devastating story, and we miss Lonnie a lot. Um, but it's not just this one story, like this is happening all the time. And were Lonnie not such an amazing soccer player, I wouldn't be here telling this story. Um, but there's a lot of Lonnies out there who couldn't juggle the ball like he could and dribble past 8 people like he could, and that's why I'm not telling their stories right now. But yeah, that's what I would say.
Man, it's wow. Yeah, I mean, I'm so sorry. I remember, so sorry for your loss. That you just don't ever get over that kind of thing. Um,
Yeah, look at this. Look at this good-looking guy. There he is. That's our team.
oh my gosh,
That's Lon right there.
it's amazing.
Yeah.
I
But
watched a
Lon,
couple. I saw some of the videos you posted of him
he's
playing.
nuts, man.
Oh, I mean,
He was.
it just reminds me of all those, like, brilliant play people I grew up with in Cameroon, like playing, like, these just like these
He used
gold
to. If
mines. And
somebody put in a hard tackle on him, his response wasn't like "Let's go score." It was like, "Let me dribble past this person until they give up." And he would juggle the ball over them. He would put it through their legs. Like, we played center midfield together, so I was standing wide open. Like, Lonnie, give me the ball. Lonnie, give me the ball. After after a while, I learned I wasn't getting the ball until this person like looked up at Lonnie, like, okay, you win,
yeah,
and then the game could proceed. But he would, oh my goodness, I would not want to foul Lonnie.
that's
It's
amazing.
not, it does not bode well for you
No,
afterward.
absolutely not. Well,
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna end with one more question for you, Josh, and that's like, I think there's a lot of people who feel paralyzed by the issue of homelessness because it's so big. And you've heard me say this, I'm sure, 100 times. But it just rings true to me in my experience that well-intentioned people who don't know what to do end up doing nothing. So what's one thing that a well-intentioned person who maybe doesn't have the experience that you and I have, or maybe not don't have the time, or whatever, like, what's one thing that anyone can do to try to humanize and care for their homeless neighbors?
Yeah, a really small thing that somebody could do. The articles of clothing that people need the most when they're homeless and living on the streets are socks and underwear. And people don't really think to be carrying around socks and underwear. Um, we do that. So the easiest way to start a conversation with someone, or just to, I've typically will shove a pair of socks in my jacket pocket when I leave. And if I see someone, I'll just say, "Hey, you need a pair of socks?" And typically it's yes. Like, how'd you know? I
Yeah.
did. Um, and that, I think, if somebody wanted to do something small and maybe build up to doing something more, that's a really easy way, because the response is overwhelmingly really, really positive. Um, and I think, those were how all of our initial conversations started. It was just like, do you need a pair of socks? Two out of our 3 employees at Human, the first words I uttered to them were, "Hey, do you need a pair of socks?" And we've obviously built really great relationships since then. So um, that's what I would say. Anytime anyone reaches out to me and asks that question, that's what I say: socks and underwear. And you can get like really cheap pairs that will, do the job at like CVS, Walgreens.
New
Yeah,
socks.
yeah, yeah. Do not give your used underwear, please.
I'll never forget when I got someone shipped a box of like
Used socks.
used
Ugh.
underwear to hand out. I was like, this is going right from the UPS truck to the dumpster. That's where this is
Oh
going.
my goodness, that's nasty. Yeah, no, please, please don't give out used clothes. Or no, used clothes are okay. Use socks and underwear. Those
Yeah,
that's a
not so
different
much.
story. Yeah,
Dude, thank you so much. Again, I just can't say enough, guys. If anyone who hasn't checked out Human.nyc, I am just the biggest fan. Josh has been such a support. You've been such a support to me, such an advocate, even just to me personally, as I continue to try to learn this space. And
Well, you're the best, of
but
course.
just can't thank you enough, man. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Always great to chat with you.
All right, man. Take it easy. I am so grateful that you took the time to listen to this episode of the Neighbors with No Doors podcast. I hope you found it helpful and empowering. Just so you know, I'm releasing a book that is also going to be called Neighbors with No Doors, and I would love for you to check it out. You can find it at neighborswithnodoors.com. You can like our Facebook page or follow along on Instagram and Twitter. I'd like to thank my producer, Rex Harson, for helping me put this together, as well as the many guests who gave me the gift of their time and their story. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.